It started on a quiet afternoon, when the sun was folding into the horizon and the neighborhood seemed nothing but ordinary. Yet, behind one single window, a soft cry echoed like a secret begging to be revealed. People passed by pretending not to hear, convincing themselves that some things are just family problems. But there was one young boy who couldn't ignore the suffering anymore, his tiny hands shaking as he dialed for help. The police officer who arrived took just one brief glance, shrugged, and drove away as if the plea had been nothing more than childish imagination. That moment changed something inside the child, something that whispered, "No one cares." But someone had heard. Someone from the outskirts, where rumbling engines are louder than excuses, and brotherhood weighs heavier than silence. Days passed, each feeling longer than the last, and the abusive home turned darker than ever before. The boy learned to hide bruises beneath long sleeves and wear forced smiles to mask fear. Neighbors whispered, but nobody acted, because fear makes cowards of many and heroes of few. Meanwhile, a biker rode past that same street every day, noticing the nervous eyes of the child like cracks on thin glass. He recognized the silent cry. He had once lived that life. Those who survive pain develop a special kind of vision, one that sees the invisible wounds left behind by cruelty. One evening, the child sat on the curb alone, trembling. The biker approached, offering not candy or empty promises, but a gentle question. "Kid, you okay?" The boy hesitated, then whispered truth so heavy it almost collapsed onto the pavement. The biker listened, not with ears, but with his own scars. He nodded once, silently promising something far greater than the officer could ever comprehend. He rode away, leaving behind a trail of dust and hope, something rare in that street. The boy didn't know it yet, but a storm was coming, the loud, leather-clad kind that doesn't ask twice. When word spread among the Hells Angels, engines roared like thunder, awakening the sleeping city. Brotherhood wasn't just a slogan embroidered on denim. It was blood-sworn loyalty, especially for those who couldn't defend themselves. They didn't arrive with paperwork or excuses. They arrived with presence, standing as walls made of muscle, steel, and unbreakable conviction. For the first time, the boy saw adults who didn't look away. Adults who stared straight into injustice without blinking. And when that same officer returned, only to find dozens of polished boots standing between him and the house he once ignored, he realized something chilling. Neglect has consequences, and silence can scream louder than noise. The engines hummed like a warning across the neighborhood, vibrating through the bones of anyone who ever dared shut their eyes to the suffering of a child. From that point on, everything changed, because once the angels take over, justice does not whisper, it roars. The following morning, the boy walked to school with his head low, the sting on his cheek hidden beneath carefully placed hair. No one asked questions. It was easier not to. But as he passed the local diner, he noticed a row of motorcycles lined like metallic beasts sleeping under the sun. The biker from the night before leaned against one, sipping coffee and pretending not to notice the kid, until their eyes met. A subtle nod was exchanged, a silent code that meant, "You are not alone." For the first time in what felt like forever, the boy felt seen, and that feeling echoed deeper than any bruise could reach. Inside the diner, murmurs filled the air. The Hells Angels didn't blend. They occupied space with an aura heavier than leather jackets. Locals whispered about trouble, about danger, about anything other than the real issue at hand. But the biker's stare tracked the boy's every step, analyzing his body language with the precision of someone who knew trauma by heart. When he spotted fresh marks, his jaw tightened. That subtle reaction held more intention than 1,000 promises from law enforcement ever could. Later that day, the officer who dismissed the boy's plea cruised by the street, eyes darting nervously at the growing number of bikes parked nearby. He chewed on doubt, wondering if he should intervene or pretend none of this concerned him. But rationalization is a powerful drug, and he convinced himself that everything would work itself out. Meanwhile, the boy returned home to a house that felt more like a cage, where footsteps in the hallway triggered tremors in his chest. Sometimes, the most dangerous battlefields are paved with carpet and silence. As evening settled, The abusive adult returned home, already fueled by bitterness and the sour smell of cheap alcohol. The boy braced himself, shrinking into corners and wishing to be invisible. Anger hit like lightning, quick, loud, and destructive. But what neither of them realized was that on the sidewalk outside, engines whispered like restless wolves, waiting for a single signal. Brotherhood does not need words. It listens to fear in the wind. Just as the shouting inside escalated into screams recognizable even through brick walls, a single biker approached the door, knocking once, calm and steady. No flashing lights, no paperwork, just presence. When the door opened and the adult saw leather patches stitched with legacy, he froze. Fear recognized something older and stronger staring back. That knock wasn't a threat. It was a warning. The kind that says, "We know, and we are watching." The boy, hidden behind the stairs, witnessed the moment power shifted in his home for the first time. The following day, the school counselor noticed a change. The boy seemed quieter, but not in the defeated way she was used to seeing. Instead, there was a spark, small, fragile, but ignited. She tried once more to ask about his home life, and although his lips trembled, he stayed silent. Trust was a luxury he had never been able to afford. Still, the biker's silent promise lingered like a shield around him. Sometimes, hope arrives not through solutions, but through the feeling that someone is finally paying attention. Meanwhile, the officer who had ignored the original complaint received a call from his chief. Rumors were expanding faster than smoke from a wildfire. Why are bikers patrolling your neighborhood? Why was a child screaming last night? The officer forced nervous laughs, making excuses about misunderstandings and neighborhood gossip. But guilt scratched beneath his skin. He had been trained to serve and protect. Yet he chose convenience over courage. That failure now echoed through every corner of his reputation. On the other side of town, at the biker clubhouse, the members discussed the situation around a battered wooden table. One rode with fists constantly clenched. Another carried the calm of someone who had survived his own demons. They weren't looking for glory or violence. They were seeking justice for a child society had abandoned. Stories poured out about their own scars, about memories of homes where love was rationed like currency. What unites men is not perfection, but shared wounds. And they refused to let history repeat. The boy's abuser noticed the motorcycles too. Every rumbling engine outside the window gnawed on his fear, pushing paranoia into every corner of his mind. He slammed windows shut, double-checked locks, and whispered curses about meddling outsiders. But deep down, he knew the truth. Predators thrive in darkness, and when light arrives, their power dissolves. The boy watched quietly, realizing that the fear had finally shifted to the right person. Days passed, and the boy found himself walking home accompanied by the soft chorus of rolling engines behind him. Not too close to scare, but near enough to warn. The kids who once bullied him kept their distance now. Teachers noticed he walked straighter, eyes lifted instead of glued to the floor. That single gesture, protection without possession, reshaped his world. In the shadows of roaring machines, he found what many search for their entire lives, a sense of belonging. And that was only the beginning. That evening, the boy found himself at the diner again, clutching a warm cup of cocoa gifted by one of the bikers. The laughter around him wasn't loud or wild. It was comforting, a gentle rumble of voices that sounded like safety. One of the older bikers leaned in, telling stories about how he once escaped a violent home. He didn't sugarcoat reality. He painted truth with raw honesty, letting the boy know that pain does not define destiny. For the first time, the child learned that survival wasn't shameful. It was heroic. Every bruise carried a chapter, every tear a lesson written on skin. Across the street, the officer parked his car and watched the scene. He saw the boy smiling, truly smiling, for the first time in weeks. The realization hit him like a cold wave. What he had dismissed so casually was now being handled by men society labeled as dangerous. He gripped his steering wheel, wrestling with guilt and pride. Perhaps law books didn't teach everything. Sometimes, humanity did. The weight of his mistake pressed harder with each passing minute. Inside the boy's home, tension built like storm clouds. The abuser paced, growling under his breath, smashing objects unnecessarily. Control was slipping, and desperation is the birthplace of cruelty. Every time he peered through the blinds and saw a black leather jacket stroll by, his grip on power loosened. Fear is often the greatest teacher, and he was finally becoming the student. The boy watched this shift silently, learning that darkness trembles when confronted by unwavering light. At school, word began to spread about the bikers. Rumors flew like paper planes, some shaped with admiration, others dipped in judgment. The boy was called lucky by some, trouble by others. But he felt neither. What he felt was supported. Bullies who once pushed him against lockers now turned away when the faint echo of engines drifted through the windows. It wasn't violence they feared. It was the loyalty those engines represented. That night, as he lay in bed, the boy listened to the distant purr of motorcycles circling like guardian wolves. For the first time in his life, he didn't cry into the pillow. Instead, he allowed a small smile to slip onto his face. Protection had arrived in the most unexpected form, teaching him that family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes, it's forged in exhaust fumes and thunderous wheels that refuse to remain silent against injustice. Days later, the abusive adult reached a breaking point. Fueled by anger and humiliation, he stumbled out of the house with slurred threats, heading toward the diner. The door swung open violently, startling everyone inside. Conversations paused. Cups froze midair. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. The biker who had befriended the boy slowly stood up, his expression calm but carved with steel. He didn't need to posture. His presence spoke volumes, echoing a promise he had made without words. The abuser barked accusations, trying to reclaim dominance through volume and intimidation. But no one flinched. The boy watched from the corner, spine trembling. Confrontation was the demon of his nightmares. Yet something felt different now. Surrounded by people who refused to look away, the boy saw a reflection of his own courage forming in their eyes. The abusive adult's voice cracked, his confidence thinning like worn fabric. For the first time, he wasn't the biggest threat in the room. One of the older bikers calmly placed his coffee down and approached, his voice steady and low. He spoke not of vengeance, but accountability, reminding the abuser that actions have consequences and that a community will rise when one child cries alone. Each word struck like a hammer, forging truth into undeniable shape. The other bikers nodded, their silence louder than any punch could ever be. The abuser stepped back, realizing that violence had lost its audience. The officer entered moments later, summoned by a nervous call. He froze when he saw the dynamic. Bikers standing firm, the abuser shrinking beneath their gaze, the boy's shelter behind them. Everything he had ignored now unfolded in front of him like a confession written in flesh and fear. Shame burned his cheeks as he realized that a group society labeled as outlaws had displayed more humanity, empathy, and action than he did on duty. Instead of reacting aggressively, the officer approached the boy, kneeling to his eye level. He apologized, not with rehearsed lines or forced remorse, but with a trembling voice that carried regret. The boy blinked, stunned. Apologies from those who failed us are rare jewels, fragile and precious. The officer promised to open a proper case, to protect him, to do what he should have done from day one. Around them, the bikers stood like pillars, silent witnesses ensuring commitment would not fade once the moment passed. The next morning, social workers arrived at the neighborhood with files in hand and concern on their faces. This time, their visit was not rushed or superficial. They spoke privately with the boy, offering him choices he never imagined he would have. For once, his voice mattered, every trembling word shaping his future. The bikers watched from a respectful distance, engines quiet, eyes focused. They didn't interfere because justice isn't about control, it's about ensuring freedom. And freedom begins with being heard. The abusive adult was escorted outside, handcuffs glinting under the midday sun. Neighbors peeked through blinds, whispering about the sudden shift in power. For years, they had turned their heads away from the bruises, the yelling, the fear. Now they witnessed consequence, as undeniable as the sound of the cuffs clicking shut. The boy stood behind the bikers, heart pounding, witnessing the end of his nightmare. It was the first moment he realized nightmares could be defeated. That afternoon, Paperwork was filed, testimony written, and evidence captured. The officer, once negligent, now moved with purpose. He avoided the biker's eyes, aware that redemption must be earned, not demanded. His actions were sharp, collected, professional. And although guilt remained heavy in his gut, he used that weight as fuel, determined never to ignore pain disguised as silence again. Sometimes, our greatest failures become our strongest motivators. The boy was placed in a temporary care, a safe home, warm meals, gentle voices that didn't echo violence. He sat at the dinner table staring at food he didn't have to gulp down in fear. His fork trembled, because safety felt foreign, almost suspicious. Healing is not immediate. It's a slow unraveling of knots tied by trauma. But as he ate, he felt his body loosen, little by little, accepting nourishment without preparing for pain. That night, the bikers parked outside the new home, lights off, engine silent. They didn't approach or knock. They simply watched, not because they didn't trust the system, but because trust must be tested. They were guardians of transition, ensuring that once a child escapes darkness, no shadow dares pull them back. Their presence offered reassurance, a promise lingering in the night air. You are safe. We are still here. Days passed, and the boy slowly adjusted to the rhythm of safety. He attended therapy, where each session peeled back layers of fear and taught him how to breathe without flinching. He learned words he never knew existed. Words like boundaries, support, and self-worth. Every time his voice cracked while telling his story, the therapist reassured him that pain was not his identity. It was something he survived, not something he must carry forever. At school, classrooms felt brighter. He no longer avoided eye contact. He raised his hand, answered questions, even joined a group activity. Teachers exchanged relieved glances, witnessing the blooming of a child once wilted by neglect. Bullies found no target anymore. Confidence is armor invisible to the eye, yet stronger than steel. The boy's new posture spoke loudly. He was no longer prey. Meanwhile, the officer attended unplanned training sessions on child protection, seeking knowledge he should have mastered long ago. Each lesson was a reminder of his greatest mistake, yet also a step toward growth. Colleagues whispered behind his back, but he ignored them. He understood now that true courage is not about ego. It's about facing your failures and transforming them. Guilt became his compass, guiding him to do right where he once did wrong. At the biker clubhouse, the men discussed the boy's progress with quiet pride. They didn't brag, they reflected. Many of them carried their own childhood ghosts, visible only in their eyes when silence fell. Helping the boy wasn't charity, it was breaking a cycle. When one of them softly said, "He's smiling more now," the room exhaled, as if releasing a breath held for decades. Brotherhood is not just shared rides, it's shared healing. On weekends, the boy visited the diner, sitting with the bikers as they joked about engines, weather, and coffee that tasted like burnt metal. He didn't understand all the references, but he understood the feeling, belonging. The biker who first listened to him ruffled his hair and said, "One day, kid, you won't flinch when someone cares." The boy didn't answer. He just smiled, and that smile was everything. Weeks later, the court hearing approached. The boy sat nervously beside his social worker, hands trembling like leaves in the wind. The courtroom felt cold, sterile, intimidating. Faces turned toward him, waiting for words he spent years swallowing. When the judge called his name, his heart pounded like thunder trapped inside a small chest. But then, through a nearby window, he saw a familiar sight. Bikes lined outside, waiting. Not barging in, just being there. Strength and stillness. Taking a deep breath, the boy stepped forward. His voice shook at first, then steadied as truth poured out. Not in anger, but clarity. He spoke of nights spent holding a pillow to muffle sobs, of footsteps that sounded like incoming storms, of bruises hidden beneath innocence. The courtroom listened, every word carving itself into hearts like etchings of survival. Even the judge leaned forward, eyes softening beneath the weight of reality. The abuser's lawyer attempted to dismiss accusations, twisting logic and questioning memory. But trauma does not forget. It stores details like a vault. The boy answered every challenge with surprising precision, proving that silence may hide suffering, but it sharpens memory. The courtroom murmured at his composure, because courage doesn't need volume, it needs truth. The officer testified next, admitting his failure openly, voice thick with remorse. He acknowledged ignoring the boy's pain and vowed publicly never to turn away again. His honesty silenced the room. Even the judge paused, acknowledging that accountability is rare and necessary. That confession, heavy as it was, shifted the balance toward justice. When the gavel finally struck, the judge declared protective custody and offered long-term guardianship with vetted families. The boy exhaled, a breath he had been holding for years. Outside, engines roared once, not in celebration, but in solidarity. The nightmare's door had closed. A new one opened, wide enough for hope to walk through without hesitation. After the verdict, the boy was placed with a foster family known throughout the community for their kindness. Their home smelled of warm bread and gentle laughter, a stark contrast to the shadows he grew up with. At first, he found it difficult to trust small gestures, like a hand on his shoulder or someone asking how his day went. His instinct was to shrink, to brace for impact. But slowly, day by day, his body learned that not every touch was a threat, and not every raised voice meant danger. Healing is not a straight road. It curves, stumbles, and rises. The foster parents enrolled him in afternoon art therapy, where colors replaced tears and brushes became tools to rewrite memory. He painted scenes of motorcycles under moonlight, powerful silhouettes standing guard outside broken houses. The therapist admired how his art portrayed strength instead of violence, protection, not revenge. Each stroke freed a memory, allowing him to transform fear into expression. The boy's world, once drawn in shades of black and blue, began to fill with reds, golds, and hopeful greens. Meanwhile, the officer visited the biker clubhouse. It was not an apology tour, it was accountability. Standing before a table of men who once intimidated him, he admitted he had allowed assumptions to paralyze his judgment. He thanked them for stepping in where he failed. The room fell silent. Then one biker extended a hand, not to erase the past, but to acknowledge growth. Respect is earned through humility, and in that moment, a new bridge formed between two worlds often divided by stereotypes. At school, the boy's confidence flourished. He joined a reading club, discovered he loved writing, and began sharing tiny pieces of his story through fictional characters. Teachers noticed his spark, praising his creativity and insight. Students who once mocked him now sat beside him, sharing laughter and trading compliments about art and books. He didn't become popular, he became valued. And value is far more powerful than popularity. One evening, as the sun dipped low, the boy rode on the back of a motorcycle for the first time. He clutched the biker's vest, not out of fear, but excitement. The wind hit his face, wild and freeing. The town blurred into streaks of color, and the roar of the engine felt like his heartbeat breaking free from rusted chains. In that ride, he discovered what it meant to move forward, not just physically, but emotionally, leaving behind a version of himself anchored in pain. Months passed, and the boy's progress became a quiet success story throughout the community. The previously silent neighbors began attending workshops on child welfare, learning how to identify abuse and report effectively. The tiny town had been shaken awake by a single child's suffering, and guilt evolved into responsibility. People vowed that never again would whispers drown out cries for help. Change often starts with a single voice, then grows into a chorus. The abuser, now behind bars, underwent mandatory counseling and restorative programs. Though justice was served, vengeance was not the goal. Rehabilitation held more power than hatred. Some would argue that monsters deserve no compassion, but the bikers believed otherwise. Break the cycle at its root, or it will grow new heads. That philosophy shaped their legacy, turning them from feared riders into guardians of the overlooked. At the diner, the bikers continued to gather. Their tone was lighter, laughter easier. They had witnessed darkness and helped pull a child into the light. Not because it was heroic, but because it was necessary. The biker who first noticed the boy often stared out the window, watching people pass with newfound awareness. He wondered how many other children hid bruises beneath their smiles. Compassion sharpened his perception, and silence no longer felt acceptable. Back at home, the boy began journaling every night. He wrote about feelings he once crushed beneath heavy pillows. He discovered how powerful words could be, how they could heal, transform, ignite. His foster mother found one of his entries, a simple line that made her eyes water. They saw me when no one else did. Sometimes acknowledgement is the first step toward reclaiming identity. One weekend, the officer invited the boy to speak at a local event about child safety. Nervous but determined, he stood before a small crowd. His voice quivered, but his message echoed strong. Listen, don't assume, don't walk away. Applause followed, loud and sincere. As he stepped down, he glanced toward a familiar corner, where bikers stood quietly, arms crossed, pride glowing in their eyes. They didn't cheer because they didn't need to. Their silence said everything. Seasons changed, leaves turned golden, and the boy blossomed into someone unrecognizable to his former self. His confidence was gentle, not loud, rooted in lessons carved from survival. He no longer woke with terror in his chest. He woke with dreams. He read books about courage, pursued art projects, and even helped younger kids who looked anxious or lonely. He had become what he never had, a protector. The officer and the bikers formed an unlikely alliance with local authorities, organizing patrols, charity rides, and fundraising events for child advocacy centers. Stereotypes dissolved like smoke. People realized that leather jackets and badges could stand side by side for a shared cause. Rumors turned into respect, and fear transformed into admiration. The community evolved, simply because justice and compassion found common ground. The boy's foster parents considered adoption, their home filled with warmth that no bloodline could define. When they asked him if he wanted to stay forever, tears streamed down his cheeks, not from sadness, but relief. He nodded, unable to speak. He finally belonged somewhere permanent, a place where footsteps brought comfort, not dread. Paperwork began, but bonds were already signed in hearts. Years later, on a sunlit afternoon, a row of motorcycles lined up outside a courthouse. Not for battle, but celebration. The boy, now older, taller, smiling, walked out holding his official adoption documents. The engines roared in unison, like thunder applauding. The biker who first spoke to him placed a patch in his hand. It wasn't a membership badge. It was a reminder. Brotherhood is chosen, not imposed. That night, around the fire pit at the clubhouse, the boy looked at the faces that once scared him. He realized these men had become guardians, mentors, family. He whispered a simple thank you. The biker chuckled, tapping his shoulder gently. Kid, you don't thank family. You ride with them. And beneath the stars, surrounded by laughter, chrome, and loyalty, he finally understood. Sometimes, angels don't fall from the sky. They roll in on two wheels, roaring against the silence. As years passed, the boy who once hid behind trembling breaths grew into a confident young man, not defined by the pain he endured, but shaped by the courage he discovered along the way. He learned that wounds may leave marks, but they do not dictate destiny. What once felt like a cage became a memory he used to help others break free. He carried the lessons of brotherhood, empathy, and vigilance into every room he entered. And whenever doubt tried to whisper, he remembered the roar of engines outside his window, a sound that promised he was never alone. The community transformed as well. Those who once closed their blinds in fear chose instead to face problems head-on, reporting suspicious behavior and checking on vulnerable children. The officer who once ignored a desperate plea became a champion of protection, organizing awareness campaigns and teaching others to recognize silent cries for help. Pain, once swept under rugs and dismissed as family issues, was now confronted openly, breaking cycles that had persisted for generations. Healing did not come overnight, but step by step, breath by breath. The Hells Angels never claimed the spotlight. They continued riding because that was their nature, but their presence became a quiet reassurance throughout town. People realized that heroes do not always wear badges or suits. Sometimes, they were leather patched with loyalty and history. Their actions became legend not because of violence, but because of compassion. They taught everyone that power, when rooted in empathy, becomes protection, not fear. And that lesson resonated far deeper than any courtroom verdict ever could. On the day he officially became part of his new family, the now teenager stood taller, surrounded by smiling faces. He looked back only once, not to relive pain, but to honor how far he had traveled. The roar of engines signaled not an ending, but a beginning. His past did not vanish. It transformed into fuel for a brighter road ahead. And from that point forward, he became a beacon for others, living proof that a single act of attention can rewrite a lifetime of silence. So let this story settle in your heart. If you ever see signs of suffering, do not look away. Be the one who listens, the one who speaks, the one who chooses courage when others choose comfort. Stories like this remind us that protection is not a duty reserved for the brave. It is a responsibility shared by all. If this message moved you, consider subscribing to the channel, liking this video, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your voice may be the one that inspires someone else to take action. Together, we keep engines roaring against silence.